So I want to read to you another parable. I want to read to you a parable that we probably don't normally read and don't normally discuss. The parable of the shrewd manager from Luke 16. Luke 16:1. And Jesus said to his disciples, "There was once a rich man who had a servant who managed his property. The rich man was told that the manager was wasting his master's money, so he called him in and said, 'What is this I hear about you? Hand in a complete account of your handling of my property, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Now the servant said to himself, 'My master is going to dismiss me from my job. What shall I do? I am not strong enough to dig ditches, and I am ashamed to beg. Now I know what I will do. Then when my job is done, I will have friends who will welcome me in their homes.' So he called in all the people who were in debt to his master. He asked the first one, 'How much do you owe my master?' 100 barrels of olive oil,' he answered. 'Here is your account,' the manager told him. 'Sit down and write 50. Then he asked another one, 'And you, how much do you owe?' 1,000 sacks of wheat, he answered. 'Here is your account,' the manager told him. 'Write 800. As a result, the master of the dishonest manager praised him for doing such a shrewd thing, because the people of this world are much more shrewd in their handling of affairs than the people who belong to the light. And Jesus went on to say, 'And so I tell you, make friends for yourselves with worldly wealth, so that when it gives out, you will be welcomed in the eternal home.'" This is what is generally called a difficult passage. You read the commentary, it says it's difficult. You read the Greek commentary, it says it's difficult. In Greek, it's just a difficult passage. And yet, that's 9 verses, and Jesus goes on with some auxiliary sayings which are quite difficult as well. But let's say that's a good solid 9 verses from the middle of Luke's Gospel. This is not Deuteronomy. How often do you read that? How often do I preach on it? I want to speak to you this morning about difficult passages about Jesus, about things that Jesus says that are tricky and difficult. Now, what do I mean by difficult? I mean, really, that when we read them, or we have them read to us, we feel it doesn't fit in with our image of Jesus. Jesus is purity and honesty and all this kind of thing. This is a totally unjust guy. Not only is he dishonest, but he digs himself out of a hole by being more dishonest than he was in the first place. And yet he is commended for being shrewd or astute, as we may translate it. And then Jesus rounds it off by saying, you're going to get good at this sort of thing so that you will be okay when you get to heaven. And it's all, you think, what about treasure in heaven and not on earth, and not worrying about this and worrying about that? What about dishonesty? What is this saying? Well, if you don't read it, it doesn't say anything. And that difficulty means that we say it's not so much that it's telling us to do something we don't like. In fact, we don't know what it is telling us to do, or it doesn't fit in with where we are with Jesus. So we tend not to read it, and people like me tend not to preach about it, and people who write devotional books and Bible reading notes tend not to put this in the devotional books and the Bible reading notes. So it tends to sink below the horizon. And we are deeply suspicious of academic theologians who find a simple answer in this by digging around, but it's not quite convincing. After all, the parables are not supposed to be complicated. The parables are supposed to be for the average man in the field in Israel at the time to get the message, not have to go off and do some PhD to understand what it means. So we don't. Now, clearly this is not a good thing, because these difficult sayings of Jesus are remarkably common. If you read something like Mark's Gospel, I'm amazed how much of it is tricky. amongst all the sort of stuff that we know and we love. We love, I don't know, the parable of the prodigal son, the good Samaritan, the sower, all that sort of thing, bright day, all of that. But the other things around it, there's quite often, I mean, what about when Jesus says to that lady who's begging him for help? What does he say? He says, it is not right to give the children's food to the dogs. It jars with you. What does he say that for, like that? And even dear old Peter, Peter up till then has been having a good day. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Right at last, inspired by the Spirit. Jesus tells him he's going to be crucified and all this sort of thing. And Peter says, I can't do that. But Jesus does not say to him, you've not got it, Peter. I need to explain this a bit more to you. He says, get thee behind me, Satan. That is a hard word. Now, what happens if we filter out these bits? Well, what happens is that we tend to assemble from Sunday school onwards a whole corpus, a whole mass of parables, teachings and things of Jesus, which we incorporate into what he says to us, our view of Jesus. There's nothing wrong with it at all. We're not saying that this is just gentle Jesus, meek and mild. We know a lot more about the Bible than that. But we have a whole series of, I say, let's go for the parable of the Good Samaritan. Let's go for the parable of the sower. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, and talks about the lost sheep and all this. We have all of that. And not only easy things, but Jesus' challenges to love your enemies and love your neighbour and preach the gospel throughout the world. But those challenges are predictable because I go on preaching about them and you go on listening to them. And so it is sort of something which is built on and built on and built on until we have our basic doctrine of Jesus and the gospel and the kingdom. And it's all good stuff. But having done that, it's reinforced by the fact that if something doesn't fit in, we don't read it. If something jars with it, we put it to one side as difficult. So it's not surprising it's not going to change or modify if the bits that you have. So what's happening is what's called triage. You get this in empirical science today. Because modern science has decided that there is no God, they have a whole lot of evidence that shows that it'll all work without God. But every time any evidence pops up in the natural world, however good the evidence is, which showed that it'd be much more efficient to the natural order, if we were to say there is a God, they dismiss it as unreliable evidence because it's evidence they don't like. So it's not surprising that science doesn't move on, it might move on. Or think more trivially about, politicians. Now, I don't know what you think about politicians, but think about, sort of Boris. Oh, man with the hair. Right. Or Trump. Now, whatever your politics are, we tend to get a feeling for how we feel about them. But we don't, once you've decided this is a terrible man, if something comes up on the news which is quite sensible, you don't really want to read that because he's not sensible. Oh yeah, he's just saying that, isn't he? Just saying that, see? And if you think he's a real hero of yours, I know, Winston Churchill, a great hero of mine, but some of the things that Winston Churchill said were terrible, but I can't remember them. So my view of Winston Churchill stays much the same because it's not influenced by the things I don't like that Churchill said, And so we do a triage and we decide that we find difficult bits so we don't read them, so they don't interfere with our picture of Jesus, which is warm and affirming. We want to be loved, we want a good shepherd, but also in challenge is predictably challenging. And we're always told to be hospitable and to be generous and to be sacrificial and so on and so forth. It is challenging, but we know the challenge. And the result of this is that we do not have a completely balanced view of what Jesus says and what Jesus says about himself. We only have the bits we've got already, which may be true, but what about the rest of it? What about the tricky, edgy stuff that Jesus seems to specialize in? Because if I'm going to give my life to somebody and give my life to a cause, at least I want to be clear what the person is, what the person's saying, and what the cause is. Like these people who will go to some political demonstration and there's a big banner which says, some placard that says, and they say, oh yes, we're going to go for this. But they don't read the small print. And if that's not bad enough, it means that we don't have many of the things that Jesus said, which are very edgy and interesting and quite exciting. So that our Christianity, true and worthy as it might be, it tends to be predictable. And you don't get excited about it. Because you're hearing me say the same things about the same parables that we normally have. I was watching some free fireworks yesterday through my back window. Some of you may have been paying, I don't know, but anyway, it was in the sky, so it was all right. And I thought to myself, all those bangs and all that up there, is sometimes the way I'm looking at Jesus is like a long life bulb rather than like fireworks. It glows, it's the light, but it's not very sparkly. This is terrible. If we were to read some of this stuff, we would think, how much more interesting it would be. What about if we read some of these difficult things and take them on board and listen to them and begin to say to ourselves, wow, if we mix this in already with what I know, then Jesus is more challenging in an unpredictable way. Is saying things I didn't expect him to say. And the mix is far more potent. If we read this and inwardly digest it, we have, as we say, a God of surprises. Not predictable. The whole mix is skewed and changed. But there's more to it than God being more surprising and more interesting. When I've given Boris a good hearing, that is everything that Boris has said, good, bad and indifferent, I have a balanced view of him. When I've given Trump a fair hearing, everything he said, good, bad, indifferent and everything else, I can give him a fair hearing, but then I can decide what I think. It won't just be prejudice, because I've only heard what I want to hear, but having given him a fair hearing, I can decide what I like. Or not, because some of what they say is lies, some of what is rubbish, some of it's amusing, and some of it's very true. But I can decide. But not so with Jesus. When I hear the difficult things that Jesus said, it's not just that I have a balanced view, I allow him to speak to me of all the things he wants to say. There's more to it than that. I have no right to say that what Jesus says is rubbish. I have no right to sort of airbrush it out, do I? No, he is the Son of God. To read these difficult passages, not simply to acknowledge that Jesus is more surprising, but is to say something about his sovereignty. He can say this, and my job is to listen. In fact, he can say exactly what he likes. And that is a profound thing. He can do and he can say exactly what he likes. You see, when we were deciding it was difficult, so we didn't read it, we were standing over God and saying, this is what we'll allow you to say to us, really. Sovereignty is I speak and we listen. We are not God. God is God. And I listen. Interestingly, coming back to this actual example of a difficult parable, you have this with the master. When the servant is being dishonest in his whole career, it is his master's money that he's been wasting and stealing and whatever it is. When he then becomes shrewd and starts changing the debts of all the people who were doing business with his master, whose money is being lost? His master. So at the bottom of the page, this shrewd, dishonest manager has only been using the master's money. So the master is the one who's lost. And so the master has a perfect right to do what he likes with it. He could have thrown him into jail, or he could have commended him for being shrewd. How dare you commend him for being shrewd? Well, actually, it's my money. I can say what I like about it. I can commend him. It's my money. And it's a good parable, the way that the Lord is. He really can say what he likes. He can say, I am the good shepherd. And he can say, I think you should be more shrewd. Say what he likes. He can say, come unto me, all you are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And he can say, should we give the children's food to the dogs? And you know, when you look at a parable like this, you realize that these edgy bits, these difficult bits, the bits that might change your view, are not like we have our view of Jesus. And on the edges, there are some difficult bits which are just a little bit, well, edgy. You realize that when we in a difficult parable say, we will hear this, Lord, and we acknowledge your sovereignty to say to us whatever you like, we are acknowledging his sovereignty to say everything about everything else. The good bits are equally sovereign. We're happy with I am the good shepherd sort of thing. But that's because we're happy. He doesn't need to say that. He doesn't need to say I am the good shepherd. He doesn't need to say I am the light of the world. He doesn't need to come and die on a cross for us in that sense. We need it. He doesn't need it. In other words, once I'm prepared to read the difficult things, I'm going to read the easier things in a different light. He didn't need to say it. It's a sovereign act. Think about the parable of the talents. That's one of my favourite parables, the talents. You know, when the man goes away and he leaves these 3 servants, and he gives one a lot of talents, another a medium lot, and one only 1 talent. I remember Riding Lights Company used to do amazing sketch on this with camels and bits and pieces, and I've done it many times. It's great fun, and we all have great fun with it. But although we like the bit about we're given talents by the Lord and we ought to be using them, and if we do, we will be rewarded, we're not so much concentrating on the end of it, are we? This one man, he gets 1 talent because he's not very talented, quite literally it says. He gets the 1 talent, he doesn't do anything with it, he buries it in the field, and when he comes back, he makes a rather miserable speech and gives the king his talent back. Well, that's not good, is it? But you see how the king, how the master responds to it. He says, terrible man, he says. Terrible, this is awful, he says. The man has not been dishonest, he's not stolen anything. Here it is, he says, here is yours. And how does he respond? Take it away from him and give it to the one with all the other talents, right? And throw him into outer darkness where there will be gnashing of teeth. Are we not drifting into a difficult saying here about somebody who has not even been dishonest? And just to round it off, give it to the man with lots of talents, because to those who have much more will be given, and to those who have little it will be taken away. Great social justice there. But if I'm prepared to read that and hear the strength of how God feels about the misuse of his gifts and about the not using of his talents, if you like, then I've got a new way of looking at the other 2 with all the talents and the camels and the success. He might not have said that. It was his choice to say that. It's his choice to reward them. They don't deserve it necessarily. They're just servants. He could have said, thank you very much. He doesn't need to say, enter into the pleasure of my kingdom. He says that. We like it, we assume it, we think it's a nice parable, but he didn't need to do it. In other words, the tricky bits show us that all the other bits are equally radical. Think of it like this, just a little bit of geology. I all know about the White Cliffs of Dover, right? Now, cliffs like that are edgy, all right? Quite literally edgy, aren't they? They're quite interesting. I've done this in Dorset mainly, but you can always sit on the beach under a dangerous cliff. There's never any problem. You don't have to compete with anybody for space and all that sort of thing. A nice quiet beach, you know. No towels laid out early in the morning, anything like that. It's quite good, you know. And it's interesting because you can do the geology, and the best bits are the dangerous bits, because when they fall down you get the new fossils, you know. And you lean over the top, and I've seen people do hang gliding off the end. It's by far the most exciting thing about chalk when it gets east of the cliff. So when you go to Kent and Dover, really the most exciting bit is the cliff, but it is a bit edgy and it is a bit dangerous. But you say, well, okay, so I'm visiting Kent on my holidays and I'm having a look around, and one of the things I ought to do to get a balanced view of Kent is to visit the cliffs, because they're edgy and dangerous. But what we're saying here is, once you've got the cliff, you've got what underlies the entire North Downs and the South Downs and 2/3 of Sussex and Kent. You understand chalk downland, you understand the streams, you understand the vegetation, you understand all the landscape that you go around and visit the National Trust on, right? Because you understood the cliff. It's not just, this is an interesting, dangerous bit on the side. This gives me a new feeling about the whole lot. I'm standing on this stuff, aren't I? So if I read this stuff, I think differently about the stuff I am already reading. So what would it be with this just as an example of a difficult parable? It's not a very difficult parable at all, really. It's just that it is a bit edgy. What he is saying is, if this guy puts all this effort into just saving his neck and getting a bit of money, how much more effort should you be putting into your Christianity, your discipleship, building the kingdom, building the church and changing the world? For goodness sake. Indeed, he says at the end, if you are prepared to put a lot of effort into small things, you will be preparing yourself for heaven, because you will be the sort of person who is astute enough and shrewd enough to be preparing spiritually. That's not difficult, but the edginess makes it good to hear, because you're thinking, this man is outrageous, and he's saying, it's about time you people, you Christians, you were a bit more outrageous. I looked in the dictionary about this. Shrewd, astute, cunning, artful, clever, crafty, and opportunist. Have you ever heard a church described as shrewd, astute, cunning, artful, clever, crafty, and opportunist? Have you ever met a Christian you feel you could describe like that? You see. So that Jesus is saying, without losing any of that and warming it down a little bit, I want you to be here. This man is putting a huge energy into it. Remember what it said in Haggai? It says in Haggai, the prophet, it says, you people live in nice houses when my house is in ruins. How can you do that? Think of the effort you put into the rest of your life. What about putting some more effort? This man was all out. What about being proactive? He says, I'm in a mess. I must do something about it. The church says, we're in a mess, oh dear. Nobody wants to come anymore because of the media and television and Sunday sport, Oh. He says, I'm in a mess, so I will. He is proactive. He says, I'm not digging and I'm not begging. And the church says, oh, what should we do? Let's beg. We're a charity. Let's dig. I mean, I like digging, but it's not inspiring, is it? But let's go on digging. We'll go on doing the same services, singing the same hymns, preaching the same sermons, listening to the same parables and drinking the same coffee. We'll go on digging, He says, this is not going to work. I'm not going to do it. Jesus said, I don't want you to do that either. It's just no good plodding onto the synagogue again. Something's going to have to change here. So he says, I want you to do something which is far more shrewd. Like this man, without losing anything of it. You think about your personal spiritual life. How shrewd are you when dealing with temptation? Or are you just walking into it all the time? You keep on going onto a channel on the TV that you think, this is not really very good. Well, detune that channel. Be shrewd. Then you have to be finding it again. You won't. I think when you go into one of these go into these charity shops, for instance, and you're looking on the books, second-hand books, and you find some stuff there that you think that is not good to be reading. That's bad. Buy the whole lot, take it home and pulp it. All right? That is shrewd, rather than saying, I don't think that should be there. We had a church in Nottingham that took out a complete billboard, sort of 60-foot long thing, about their church on a board right opposite Sainsbury's in the middle of Arnold, Oh, the church doesn't advertise. Well, why didn't it advertise? What about if we blew our entire budget for Christmas on a 4-page advert in the Cornishman? that was a bit edgy? Oh, but we don't know. I mean, we got told off for that thing out the front because it says a good place to meet with God, and somebody said it was advertising. That's right. That's not advertising, it's just a fact, isn't it? You know, that we should be more shrewd, that we should be more, in terms of we've talked before, haven't we, about our talking to people about Jesus. What about we are more opportunists? Jesus is opportunist, isn't he? Remember when the rich man were giving the money into the coffers, all this money. It's at that point that he says, this poor widow with her mite has given more. That's taking a situation and exploiting it. It's not just talking to the disciples later and everybody's saying, oh, that's really bad to discourage all these really, really generous people who are keeping the temple going, you know. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. But it's very edgy, isn't it? And you can remember it, can't you? And where is it he wants to make a big speech? On the last day of the festival, the great day, when they're all there in the purification phase, he stood up, whoever is thirsty, surrounded by water, he takes it on. Does he go up onto a hill somewhere in Galilee where there's not many people around and find a donkey and sit on it and hope somebody will catch on? No, let's go, you know, for the feast when everybody's going in with palm leaves anyway, and get on a donkey on purpose and go in. And how shrewd is that? How astute. I think we need to be in your conversations, in the way you bring in Jesus, in the prayers that you pray. How about we are more cunning, more artful, more clever, without losing the edge of this parable? In fact, I would say, and you could quote me on this, that when it comes to evil, we should be unscrupulous. Why should you not? If Montal is anything like it was last year, it is a thoroughly black demonic festival. The best thing that could happen is that it will be high wind, very cold and torrential rain the whole evening. Hey, why don't we pray for that? Oh, we don't do that. But that's the edge of this parable, isn't it? You know, what are you going to put into it? How much sweat are you going to put into Christmas this year? Or are you going to be like me and I think, well, we're much the same as we did last year, actually. There'll be so much more interest, so much more challenge, so much more serendipity, so much more wow. We are following Jesus, not just round the normal circuit, as though Jesus walks round and round and round. We follow him round and round and round. But where is he going to go next? It's going to be loving. It's going to be who he is now, but it's going to be more than we were taking on board. Band are just going to come and play for us as we come to communion. You remember the way that Jesus used, if you like, the Passover meal as the launch for the first communion service. So, although it started the way they thought, it didn't end the way they thought. And so for them, the first half of it was easy and the second half was difficult. How about that would be with communion this morning? I come to what is familiar, but I am told something which is edgy.